Thank you. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. It's Wednesday, March 15th in the United States, and I know we're connecting in with New Zealand today. We've just had a time change to daylight savings time, so we're making adjustments. But let me start by welcoming everyone around the globe to our INACOL Leadership Webinar. The subject is future-focused education and innovations and insights from New Zealand. I am so pleased. I had the opportunity in an Eisenhower Fellowship to travel in New Zealand for 5 weeks last June, and was so impressed by all of the practitioners and educators and leaders in education and the work that's been done. I wanted to give special thanks to the entire team, family, and community at Core Education, and especially to Derek Wenma, who's joining us today, who's the Director of Core Education, who is deeply, deeply involved in working with educators and practitioners across New Zealand and actually across the globe on leading efforts to transform education systems around excellence and equity. And the work that he's done is just outstanding. Core is perhaps one of the strongest nonprofit organization I've seen, working directly with so many school leaders, working to build systems, support, and to help lead the transformation. New Zealand has also been a leader in providing learning experiences that offer students a world-class education, building the depth of knowledge through highly personalized learning. Back in 2007, when New Zealand went through a curriculum redesign to a broader sense of student success, creating the future of learning, they also worked towards personalized learning in a large initiative, and the developments that have happened in the last 10 years have been truly phenomenal. So today we're going to have the opportunity to share these insights with Derek and two principals from New Zealand to explore how some of the future focus that our education leaders around the globe are thinking through and designing new models, how they're working together to develop deeper learning and fostering whole systems change. Today's presenters are some of the most inspirational leaders that I've met, and certainly had the opportunity to meet Derek Wenma this past June in New Zealand. Let me tell you a little bit about Derek to get started. Derek has been involved with Core Education since its inception in 2003. Derek, Nick Billows, and Vince Ham set up UltraLab South, which is now Core Education, which was to embody their vision of an e-learning research and development center. With a background as a teacher, principal, educator, and education policy advisor, Derek's role at Core as Director of e-learning perfectly combines his passion for teaching and learning together with his long-held fascination with the uses of technology in education, and I would say global education trends as well. Derek is regarded as one of New Zealand education's foremost future-focused thinkers and is regularly asked to consult with policymakers and government agencies regarding future directions of New Zealand education policy and practice. He coordinates the development of Core's annual 10 trends and are widely referenced by educators and educational leaders. He's a regular speaker at conferences both nationally and internationally, maintains a blog on matters relating to e-learning and other aspects of interest to educators. Derek's blog. In recognition of his work in this area, Derek was designated as one of 2008's Global 6 by the George Lucas Education Foundation, which recognizes individuals making a difference in education. He's in the Daring Dozen in 2008. Derek's expertise is in whole school review and development, future-focused education, modern learning practice, strategic planning and policy development, virtual learning and teaching. Please join me in turning the webinar over and welcoming Derek.
Well, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora mana mihi te whānau, and greetings from New Zealand. Thank you for that introduction, Susan, and it's a real joy and privilege to be speaking with such a group of educators prepared to give up some time to hear about the experiences we're having here in New Zealand. I appreciate the overview that you've provided there. And I just need to explain or reinforce, as Susan said, my two co-presenters are just going to be a little late joining me this morning because of our misunderstanding about time, but they will be here by the time it comes to hopefully their part of the presentation and certainly for the questions. And so I have designed, or we've put the presentation together in just 3 parts. The first is a bit of an overview of New Zealand and what's happening here, and honing in on the things that we think make it special in terms of providing a future-focused context for education for our young people. And then we will look at specifically at the context of the 2 schools that I've invited the principals from, and then a very small piece of wrapping some of those ideas together in things that are happening in other parts of the country. So, introducing to you our team who will be joining us. Sandy is the principal of a primary school here in Christchurch called Beckenham Primary School, or in American terms that would be an elementary school. And Andy is a principal with quite a vast amount of experience in the secondary sector, who has just returned to New Zealand from a position at an international school to take up a role as principal of a brand new community campus, a very different way of operating a school in the city here, and his story we can tell you a little bit later. So where are we located? I just thought it would be useful for those who may not have had an opportunity to perhaps travel to New Zealand or know much about it. We are right down the very bottom of the Pacific, the arrow pointing there. A long way from anywhere, really, and that's one of the things about New Zealand is our isolation, I think, has caused us to look outwards for many years. There are just over 4 million people in New Zealand, but there are, we're told, over 1 million New Zealand passport holders living in other parts of the country, of the world. The other thing about that map that I thought was just worth mentioning here is the circle that I've included there is our major kind of connection with the world is through Asia, interestingly, and the circle represents something of significance to us because over a half of the entire global population lives within that area of the world. And so for New Zealand, it's quite an important both trading partner, but also has an important part to play in terms of the impact on our future-focused thinking and the things that are happening in our system. A couple of slides here which you'll be able to look at in more detail as you go back and review this recording, I'm sure. But you'll see our population was, I pasted that off our population clock last night, so that's about as accurate as you'll get. But you'll notice some of the other statistics down there that give you an indication of the diversity that exists in our nation. Although we've got about 2/3 of the population are of European origin, or Pakeha as they're known locally. These are white Anglo-Saxon European people. You'll notice that 54%, over half of the students in our schools of that. So there's a difference between 1/2 to 2/3. You can see that the increase in the population that's occurring in New Zealand is in these other cultural groups. So 15% of the overall population are Māori, the indigenous people in New Zealand, yet 23% of the school population are Māori. And the same in Asian origin, 9% versus 10%. And then we've got a lot of Pacific Islanders sitting here in New Zealand. In fact, our largest city, Auckland, 1.5 million, there are more Pacific Islanders living in Auckland than there are in the Pacific Islands. So that gives you a bit of a feel for the country. We're a long spread out 2 islands, but 88%, as you'll see, they live in the urban areas around here in Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin, and then there is a very small smattering of schools elsewhere. This slide just gives you an idea of the number of schools that we have right across New Zealand. So it's just over 2,500 schools, but you can see there the mix. We have a lot of different types of schools, including right down the bottom, you'll see reference to partnership schools, which is a more recent innovation in New Zealand, where we have embraced the idea that you have in the US of charter schools. So where you see partnership schools referred to in New Zealand, they are the equivalent of charter schools in the US. Predominantly, the charter schools in New Zealand have been set up to address the needs of many of our young students who are in areas of quite depleted or failing education systems, and many of those are Māori or Pacific Island students. And just finally, in terms of giving you a picture of where we are, that gives you an idea of the number of students we have in New Zealand. So by comparison with parts of the US, this would be incredibly small, certainly in terms of the entire nation, but that's what we're dealing with, and they are spread right across the whole nation. Now, Susan mentioned a little bit about New Zealand's education history, and it's really important to understand that to get a feel for where we are at the moment. Back in 1989, we had a significant education reform in New Zealand, the first really that we'd had for many years, in fact for over a century. And it was called Tomorrow's Schools, and we went from a highly centralised, very highly bureaucratic system to a very decentralised and distributed system, where every one of those 2,500 schools, regardless of whether you were a school of just one teacher and 9 students or a large school with 3,000 students, each school became its own self-managing entity with its own board of trustees operating as a small business unit. That heralded a huge difference in the way that education was provided. It brought about a huge amount of agility and responsiveness in the system, and has led us to where we are today, with schools right around the country reflecting very much the communities that they're a part of. Of course, the downside to that was it also generated an enormous amount of competitiveness between schools for students and for reputation. So with all change, there comes an upside and a downside. In 2003, I noted here, I'll just pick the eyes out and I'll refer to it later, we had the first curriculum we've ever had in New Zealand. Prior to that, New Zealand had operated on a syllabus basis, so we had a variety of syllabuses published for each of the learning areas, and had a very traditional approach to teaching and learning. But in 2003, following the research that had been coming from OECD and others, we published and began the journey of a competency-based curriculum, and I'll talk a little bit more of that, because that's really been a key anchor point for this future-focused direction. Then just last year, a second reform began to happen. Investing in Education Success is what it's called, and through that there's been a real emphasis in focusing on raising student achievement. Whereas the first reform really was about reorganising the structures and the organisation of schools, this reform really has a focus on raising educational success and raising achievement. And it's doing that by promoting the clustering of schools around the pathway that students take. So schools in geographic proximity are being encouraged to cluster together. There's a lot of incentivization in terms of additional funding, additional staffing, and promoting a high level of collaboration, so that there's a real line of sight for the students as they start in their preschool, into elementary, into secondary, and so forth. There's also a lot of incentivization within that for improving teaching practice with that same focus. The outcome is that we are now seeing the development of what they're calling communities of learning throughout the country. These are the clusters that are being formed in response to this, this new reform agenda. And so that's part of what I'm very involved with in New Zealand at the moment, and the two principals who will be joining me shortly are both in areas of Christchurch that are considering their participation. The interesting thing about it is that participation is voluntary, and I'll put in brackets there, yet inevitable, because if all the resourcing and all the incentivisation is towards this, then inevitably that's where the activity leads. And you'll note I've put there the funding for new roles that are coming in. One of my new principals is just joining me now. I'll welcome her in. But the new roles there, lead principal, lead teachers, and lead teachers between schools, are all quite new for the New Zealand context. Just welcome in here Sandy Hastings, who'll come and sit to my left. Welcome, Sandy.
Hi, Derek.
That's all right.
Good morning, everyone.
Here we go. So I'm just doing the intro. We'll come to you in just a moment, Sandy. It's great to be here. Giving them a little background. So huge emphasis on collaboration, which I think we'd all agree here in the New Zealand context now is becoming a predominant focus of activity at every level for the students, the learners, right through to the way that teachers and principals and schools operate. So that's a little bit of background there, leading to this vision statement, which I thought was interesting to just share at the moment, that as a nation, this is the sort of published aspiration that our Ministry of Education have put up there. And there are two parts of that for me. One is the emphasis on a highly connected and interdependent education system. And you'll hear examples of some of that, I guess, from Sandy and Andy, and in the examples I'll give later. But then the second one, equipping students with skills for the future, which includes their notion of who they are as people, their language, culture, identity, and so forth. And this whole future-focused, empowering them to participate as successful students in the 21st century. And I think, certainly if I was to make a reflection of what I've seen in New Zealand schools over the last 10 years anyway, there's been this significant shift in emphasis from a curriculum point of view, from just simply delivering stuff, passing on knowledge and building students' kind of internal information base, to a really strong emphasis on developing those skills and dispositions and understandings that will enable them to live in a highly change-oriented sort of world into the future. Now, a key part of that is the New Zealand curriculum that I referred to happening or coming into play in 2003. And although you won't necessarily be able to see the diagrams or illustrations, I have put a link there for anyone who's interested. You can go on and download and explore this to your heart's content. But the critical thing, if I use my arrow here, is that there's a very strong vision driving the curriculum, and that driving vision is embedded in that statement I've had just before about a future-focused view. It's underpinned by a set of values that guide the work that schools do, and schools in turn create their own set of values that guide the work that they do. And I know Sandy in her little presentations alludes to the ones in her school. Then we have the key competencies that are absolutely pivotal to that, and I'll talk about those in a second. And then the learning areas, which are what we might refer to as the traditional subjects, are a part of that as well. And all of those are tied together with some key principles, amongst which is a future-focused theme that flows throughout. So that's the structure of our curriculum, and I need to emphasise two things. First, it is a framework. It isn't a big, long book. It's only about 40 pages long, and you can read it right cover to cover, sort of after dinner one evening. The responsibility is then on individual schools to develop their school curriculum within that framework, and that reflects the local community, the local area that they live, the needs of their students, the opportunities that they have to expose students to different learning contexts and so forth. So we do have an incredible amount of freedom but tied within a framework that allows us to ensure that we have some level of accountability back at a national level. The competencies I referred to, I've just got listed on this slide, and you'll note a strong parallel between these and the global competencies that are now gaining more and more traction internationally based on the work of OECD and others. So these are the ones that were established back in 2003 in New Zealand: thinking, using language, symbols and text, managing self, relating to others, and then participating and contributing. And so they've formed the basis around which schools have developed their own curriculum. Of course, the big thing in New Zealand schools, like many other parts of the world that I've experienced, is when you start talking about competencies, there's this tension between sort of valuing what you measure, which is often, in examination time, it reverts back to that sort of first level thinking and the domains of knowledge and facts and all that sort of thing, over sort of measuring what you value. And of course, it's one of the things in terms of competencies. Once you start putting all sorts of frames in place to measure a competency, it kind of subverts what competency development is all about. But we've got some pretty good examples of schools having really worked with us deeply and aspire to see their students graduate, and many schools articulate this in a form of a graduate profile, to graduate with these particular skills and dispositions being able to be recognised in certain ways. So our big challenges in New Zealand are summarised on this slide. I think we've got, if you were to ask most principals through New Zealand or education leaders or into the ministry, on the left-hand side we've had a series of things happen to us recently in the country, significantly in Christchurch, earthquakes, which you might think has just affected Christchurch, but actually is affecting the whole of New Zealand, because now every school in New Zealand is being looked at for earthquake strengthening and how up to date it is. We've got leaky buildings. We had a huge number of school buildings that were built or upgraded through the 1990s particularly, but they were done in a particular style of architecture that now sees them rotting out, and we're up for hundreds and hundreds of school classrooms that need to be replaced or rebuilt. And over the top of that, we've got population growth, particularly in places like Auckland, where currently the number of young people seeking to enter school over the next 5 years, we've got the figures pretty accurately there. In order to meet the demand just in that one city, they need to be building 5 new classrooms a week, which is actually an impossibility. There are not the builders, there's not the material, and there's not the land. So there are huge demands to find new and different ways of meeting the educational needs of students. But the outcome of that is to think about, I've called it new buildings, but we might, new learning spaces, new learning design, and Sandy particularly has got some good stories to tell about that. On the other side of the ledger is this challenge when we're a future-focused orientation, is that there are changing skills required to be present and to be active in the world in front of us, and particularly for our young people, which requires us to have a new curriculum, empowered and enabled and enacted by developments in technology. And the outcome of that is we need new pedagogies. And so one of the areas of focus for my work in particular is working with schools to make that mega jump, really, beyond the pedagogies of the past and into the sorts of things that, again, Sandy will talk about, and Andy, when he arrives, are doing in their schools. So just before I hand over to Sandy to explain her context, a little context here. In Christchurch, one of the things that happened just 6 years ago, we had a significant earthquake. I'm looking out the window of the centre that we're sitting in now, and where there used to be buildings, there's empty earth here still 6 years later. where we were a city of high-rises, we're slowly seeing buildings being built, but none of them will be taller than 5 to 7 stories in the very centre of the city here. A number of lives were lost. It was devastating. And amongst that devastation was the impact on many of our schools, pretty much all of them, wasn't it really?
And our children.
And yes, and so the subsequent, the subsequent impact on the lives of our children, the families, their communities, and of course our teachers. In the immediate aftermath of that, we had a whole lot of things happen. Like there were 5 of the schools, the secondary schools, that were just no longer habitable, and so arrangements were made to what we've called double bunk them. So a school whose buildings were still intact would start earlier in the morning, about 7:30, and go through to lunchtime, and another school, students from there would be bussed into that school to use their buildings later in the afternoon. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that was it had a huge impact and challenged the thinking and the way that schools operate, but it also required a change in our legislation to do that, which has made us realise how limited that legislation has been. And that's another thing I haven't mentioned, but we're just undergoing a lot of legislation reform, which is going to give us even greater freedom to think about the way that we do that. So in Christchurch, we've got communities keen to rebuild their identity and purpose, and Andy, who's just appeared on my right, welcome Andy, is one of those who's got a huge challenge here in the city in bringing together what have effectively been 4 communities into now a single identity at a school. But I'll let him tell you a little bit about that as he comes on. So this slide really is just to remind us that one part of this future-focused theme is the impact that it's had on buildings, and both Sandy and Andy have got that as part of their story, that as we've been building and creating new buildings, we're not doing that in the traditional cells and bells structure as we've referred to them in the past, where you get teachers isolated with a group of students in a single learning space. We've moved much more into these open, flexible and collaborative learning spaces, which in turn challenges the nature of teaching and learning, because you can't teach in the same way as you used to in these areas, and the emphasis on global competency development comes to the fore. So look, oh, I've forgotten I'd put this in. So with the buildings comes the emphasis on modern learning practice and new pedagogies. And this slide, when I was looking for something to illustrate that, is from a course that we run here at Core Education, and we've had now hundreds of teachers go through it. But it gives you an idea of the scope of what we look at there, where we rethink our notions about learners and their agency and the things that we do, the skills and dispositions they need for that, and about what that means for teachers and teaching, what it means in terms of the process and of learning, and then what it means for the way we think about the support mechanisms that we provide for them in their schools. So those things we referred to, you know, the new buildings, the new pedagogies, are quite important here. So with that, we turn now to Beckenham School. Welcome.
Thank you.
Sandy, and we'll turn it over to you to share with us your experience through all of this.
I don't know if it's good afternoon to you, it's good morning here. I started at Beckenham School in 2011 in May, and it was 2-3 months after the devastating earthquake that Derek's just referred to. We were reasonably fortunate we hadn't lost buildings. We lost our beautiful school swimming pool, which was a devastating loss for our community. However, we did have buildings that were damaged and ultimately determined that needed replacing. We then, in 2012, a year later, you'll see in the image there, suffered a fire which took out our library and a multi-purpose space, nearly took our school hall as well. So these, and it was determined we had leaky buildings. So we ended up being quite high up on the rebuild program, and our school is now currently halfway through a significant rebuild. We have 20 classroom spaces that in 2011 or 2012 were all individual single classroom spaces. where the teacher worked with their group of 25 to 30 students without any interference or support from their colleagues. They were really kings of their own empires, if you like, and in spite of everyone's best efforts to be collaborative and planning and thinking, what happened in those classrooms really was down to the capabilities, the skills, and the dispositions of that individual teacher. We realised that we were going to be building classroom spaces that were very different to what we'd had before. We were excited by that and extremely nervous. We worked very closely with a range of support providers. Derek came and worked with our school to start to think about what would learning look like and what would teaching look like if we could do it differently. And why would that be important? We used some questions from Julia Aitken around making sure we understood what our values and beliefs were, what were the principles that came from those values and beliefs or that supported them, and then what would our practice look like. And we had to really go back and examine everything that we did and say, why do we do it this way? How does that practice reflect what we believe? How does that practice really support what we think is good teaching and learning? From that process, we created our new school values, and you can see them illustrated here in this diagram. The principles that underpin these values or that support them are the principles of the New Zealand curriculum. We decided not to rewrite those or to alter them in any way. We felt that they absolutely were the principles that we felt were right for our school, and these values underpin everything that we do. We keep coming back to them. They're living and breathing in our school. Our children can talk about them. Learning on a daily basis is reflected back to these values. So our children talk about loving learning. We talk about this is a challenge and we love a challenge. So in our learning, when we are finding something difficult, we celebrate that and say that's because we love a challenge, and we know that if we're challenging ourselves, then we're able to grow and develop as learners. This doesn't happen overnight. It took at least 3 or 4 years for us to work through this process, and it's a process that we're continually working towards. I don't think we'll ever publish this into a booklet because it will then become redundant. It's constantly changing as our staff turnover, and we have a very stable staff, but we still, every year, there's new people coming in and out. We need to go back to our beliefs and our values to make sure everybody's still on the same page and understanding what these are about. We're constantly asking, do our practices give agency to children in their learning? Does this practice that we have enhance the mana of our children? Mana is a Māori word, and it really is talking about the dignity, the strength of the child. So we've looked really closely at the way teachers manage behaviour or keep control in the classroom setting, and how can we do this in a way that supports children to be dignified and to stay engaged in their learning. Moving on to our what drives our practices, we want our practice to always be inclusive so that all students are able to be successful in their learning. We employ the principles of UDL, Universal Design for Learning, so that we start at the edges. We think about our children who are going to find this the most challenging, and we plan and design learning so that if they can be successful, everyone can be successful. We look at strengths, both of our teachers and our students, so that everything we're doing, we're trying to enhance and utilise those strengths to support them to be successful in areas that they find more challenging. We want children to be inquiring all the time. I love when a 5-year-old starts school that they can't wait to get there. Their eyes are sparkling and they just want to be a school child. And we have a history in New Zealand that by the time they get to year 8, which is perhaps a 12-year-old, and we're ready to send them on to high schools, that somehow we've managed often to hammer that sparkle out, and they trudge, they drag their feet to school, and they really, you know, we have some real challenge in New Zealand with students at the adolescent age becoming very disengaged with school. So one of our biggest challenges on a daily basis is keeping the smile, keeping the sparkle, keeping the joy of learning alive so that students want to be engaged. And part of that's about collaboration. We know that in the workplace, I mean, just thinking about the three of us here today, this is a collaborative process. It's not something that we would choose to necessarily do on our own. And so we understand that our learners need to be able to collaborate. For that, they need to have strong relationships, and they need to have agency. They need to be given the opportunity to say, actually, what I'd really like to learn about is this. And that's where my passion is. And if we let them follow their passions, then learning happens in a much, much more authentic way. An example of student agency in learning that I thought I'd share with you this morning is happening in our Year 7 and 8 classes, and these are children who are 11 and 12, 13 years old. And I've got a team of 3 teachers who work together there, and one of them in particular is running a maths program that is completely student directed. So they look at the curriculum together. They understand these are the topics that need to be unpacked and worked through within the maths curriculum over the year. They pick a topic to start with, and then the teacher and the students design the learning in that topic. They look at the goals and the intentions that need to be worked on. They work out how to assess where the students are up to. The students are able to self-assess often with the support of the teacher and go, actually, I can do that bit, but what I really need help with is this part here. The teacher runs workshops. The children self-select into those workshops, or they may all start a workshop, and then within 5 or 10 minutes, they can go, actually, I now am able to work on my own. I understand what I need to do, and they can go off and select from a bank of learning tasks. They can select the one that they feel is going to support them best in learning that piece of information, or learning that skill, or that mathematical concept. The teacher has developed a site that resources are up on, including videos, activity tasks, and the children can self-select from that bank of learning opportunities. They work both online, as you can see in the image there. They're working on paper. They are working using equipment. They're outside doing measuring. They're interviewing. They are working independently. They're working collaboratively. And this is just a continually evolving and ongoing process. They log their work using an online tool, online forum, and the teacher's able to comment or report back feedback to them on a daily basis, both in person in the classroom and using the online support that they have there. The children support one another. In the classroom, it's not unusual to hear them say, let's try and do this one together. Or, how did you do that? Have you seen this cool video? I've just found it, or I watched that one, and that's the one that helped me understand that bit of the concept that I was stuck on. I've heard a student say to the teacher, have you seen this video? I've just found it. You could add it to the site. So together they are co-constructing the learning. They are supporting one another. When one person gets stuck, it becomes the responsibility of the group to support them and help them progress their learning. It's really exciting stuff.
Thanks, Sandy. That's really appreciate that insight. It's exactly what we'd hoped. We hadn't rehearsed this, but that's so spot on and illustrates so beautifully what we were just chatting about at the beginning. Going to move over to Andy now and invite Andy to, if I can make look, there he is, just to prove it. Andy, you've had a huge challenge, just like Sandy, but actually quite different with a new school. So tell us a little bit about your experience.
Cool. Thanks, Derek. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Thank you. So just listening to Sandy talk about her experience at Beckenham School, there are some real similarities in terms of direction that we're going in, which is, I guess for me, I'm from a secondary background mainly, but now find myself leading with a group of others a K-12 school, actually, as you'll know them, a year 1 to 13 school for us. So slightly different beast from Sandy, but there's some real similarities, as I say. So just to give a bit of context about who we are in the east of Christchurch, which is an area that was very hard hit by the quakes. And our Minister of Education decided to rethink the education model out east, decided to close 4 or 5 schools and open one K-12 school on one site. So what you're seeing there is just prior to opening, I think, our buildings. It's not quite all of it, but it gives you a sense of where we are. We are a design, like Derek just talked about, so he had mentioned as the modern learning environments before. We quite like the notion of flexible learning environments. We do have a public-private partnership, which is a different funding model, and I'm not sure how relevant that is here, but that has implications more around property and how that's used and how that's maintained over the next 25 years. As I mentioned before, we are a closure of 4 schools, which has its interesting dynamic. But what we're finding now with our role, we were predicted to open with a role of 919, and we think that our role is about 920. So the ministry did a very good job there. What we are finding, though, is that about 50% of our students are not from the closing schools, but they're actually from a number of different schools from around Christchurch and around New Zealand. So the reason I mention that is because that has an implication on other things from a perspective. So that's sort of a bit of context about where we are. Just a few more things. That image is our theatre, so it gives you a sense of the quality and the scale of the facility that we're fortunate to have, particularly for our primary school students who aren't necessarily used to having such enormous and highly facilities on site. So that's the advantage of the K-12 model. Aranui, where we are, Aranui Wainoni, I've described them as a proud community because I think they are a community that are probably one of our poorest communities in Christchurch and probably possibly even across New Zealand. But they are fiercely proud of who they are. Very multicultural, so our demographic is about 50% New Zealand and European Pakeha, about 35 to 40% Māori, and about 15% from the Pacific Islands. So I've put there financially and emotionally impoverished, and the quakes really exaggerated how that has been for them. So when I came back, I was overseas working when the quakes were on, so I've come back to an area that is still recovering roads-wise, financially. We've still got multiple families living in houses, living in garages, very close, if not below, the breadline. So really struggling to live from day to day. So hence, the term that I've just used there, financially and emotionally impoverished, really, and made worse by the quakes. We know we're an area that, according to our Education Ministry, about possibly between 50 and 60% of school-aged children leave the area to go to other schools. And really, for those that remain, whilst education has been successful for some, we don't believe it's been successful for every child that's remained in the community or potentially could remain in the community. So Derek asked me just to talk about some of our challenges that we have. And I just want to focus on those 3 first, and then if there is time, then we can flesh out from there. I've heard Derek this morning talk about learning and I guess new pedagogies in the new spaces. Sandy's talking about self-directed learning and those things as well. I guess for us, what I've put there really is turning rhetoric into reality. One of the attractions for me for this position was we read so much and we hear so much about our experts from both New Zealand and abroad about how learning could be, should be, in preparation for the 21st century and beyond. So I saw this as an opportunity to turn some of that into reality. And I guess unique and different from Sandy's situation Sandy is trying to rebuild the plane while she's flying it, if you like. We had the absolute fortune to have a year in preparation. So I was appointed in 2015 and started on the ground with a leadership team at the start of 2016. And we've had the year in preparation trying to get our heads around what could learning look like. And again, to hark back to something Sandy said, we just wanted to rethink and revisit why is it that we do things in certain ways. Is that appropriate for purpose now? And if it's not, how might we do that? So if you take learning from K to 12 and what that looks like, and if you've ever asked yourselves, do we need to do it this way? Is there a better way? Might there be a better way in terms of what we're trying to prepare our kids for? That's absolutely the space that we've been trying to be in for the last 12 months. From everything from space to pedagogy to, our leadership to, as the diagram that Derek showed you before, to support. And with the best intentions in mind, when you get 920 students on site, a little bit of that has to be responsive to the need, and that's what we're finding 6 weeks in now. So it's an exciting space to be in, particularly for the middle school and upper years for us. I suspect that our primary colleagues have been a little bit more used to the style of learning than that's existed in secondary schools, but not totally au fait, and certainly not across the board. So it is a challenge for everyone from year 1 to 13. We appointed about 60 staff throughout the year, and so to move on, I guess we were trying to create learning which, by and large, for a number of people, hadn't necessarily been something they had done before. So the reason I put mindsets versus skill sets there was one of the messages we said in our recruiting was, you need to have the right mindset for this challenge. You need to be very open, you need to be very flexible and adaptable. You need to try and give away, we talked about unlearning what we knew, and trying to relearn what it could be in the space. So the notion of people not necessarily, I've done this before, because it wasn't the case. It was, how could this look and how can we co-construct this together with our community, with our kids, and actually with 60 different colleagues. So that's been a significant challenge, but amazing work. And recruitment for me is possibly the most important thing that we would do, I think, at schools. And then just finally, from me, the systems, I think the challenge of trying to find, to be innovative and be different and rethink what success looks like in an educational setting, but being mindful that we have an education system that requires certain things from us in a traditional way of acknowledging success, exam results, etc., and also traditional ways of delivering. So there is a lot of, I guess, question and courage required for us to stay true to what we believe. And whilst I haven't articulated our curriculum model here, I'm looking at Sandy's model of values and relationships. It's exactly the same place that we base all of that stuff from. So just in a nutshell, that's kind of where we are at the moment. Ongoing, huge challenge, huge privilege, and really looking forward to seeing how the next few years unfold.
Thanks, Andy. Susan, I'm going to turn back to you. There was some slides that I've just skipped over that were going to reinforce some of that and maybe just expand some of the things we do, but I'm mindful of time and also of the wonderful illustrations that have just come from Sandy and Andy. And so if I can go back to you, I think it would be appropriate now, just as we're into that last part of the conference, to open up for some questions perhaps. Hello, Susan, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can now, yes.
There we go. I'm sorry, I had my video and not my talking, my button pushed. So first of all, I wanted to thank Sandy and Andy for joining us today, and thank Derek, all three of you, for wonderful presentations. I'd like to invite everyone to type questions into the chat box. I've been monitoring the chat box during the discussions, and we had a few questions. One is, and let me try to provide a little context here, when we started, Derek, you talked about in 1989 the move to tomorrow's schools, making each individual school self-managing. So in the United States we have 13,000 school districts, and most schools are related to a public school district. There are some individual schools, but Sandy, when you were talking more about the process that you went through on working on developing an understanding of your shared values and beliefs, what kind of support, asking these questions that are so important around why do we do what we do in practice. When you develop this process and you explain this process is ongoing with your teachers and educators, can you describe the role of communities? Because part of the struggle that we're having right now in the United States is that the federal government and even states can't have those kinds of conversations around values, that it's so important to have them with communities to identify how you think about what success looks like for students. And it would just be helpful to learn about either the process that you initiated with a community or the ongoing process that's taking a look at values and beliefs in our education system.
Sure, Susan, thank you. Engaging with our communities is really, really important for us, and it's a challenging thing to do. Back in, I think it would have been 2012 and 2013, we invited our communities to come to meetings, and consultations is the word, I guess, that's bandied around a lot. But what we wanted to do was to bring our communities in, and we had our school hall set out with chairs not in rows so that they were facing the front and being presented to, but in small groups of circles, and we invited people to come in and sit in these groups with lots of marker pens and paper and sticky post-it notes, and we invited them to talk in small groups of 10 or 12 people in each group and describe their aspirations for their children by the time they left our school. So it was, as Derek referred to at the beginning, important for us to develop a sense of graduate profile. What do our families expect for their children by the time they leave our school? And so for us, it's when they're 13 years old and they're going on to the local high school. What was fascinating from that is almost exclusively across the community, the top priority wasn't mathematics, reading and writing. It wasn't academic ability. The top priorities were that their children were kind, that they had friends, that they knew how to relate to one another, that they were good people, and they knew how to participate and contribute in a way that was positive and constructive. And then, and that they were really happy to come to school. They wanted their children to be engaged. And there was this innate belief, this really clear understanding that academic learning would follow if those things were in place. When we got that feedback from our community, it was the most exciting thing, because it enabled us to then say, well, that's what we believe too, and we're then able to focus on those values and write those values together, so that's where we start from all the time, and learning follows.
Yeah. And that's fairly typical process for all schools.
For New Zealand schools.
Yeah.
Susan.
Yes, thank you. That's understanding that is something, it's such an important process, not just to engage the community. I really love hearing about the process that you go through, but to continue to engage, and that is happening in literally every school with communities is so critical. So I think we have time for one more quick question, unless you can stay on for just a few more minutes, which is another question for Sharon. You said that it took 3 to 4 years to get started. What would you say were your 3 main challenges, or maybe your 3 main challenges that you turned in opportunities when you got started?
It's a process that just, sometimes we felt like we got stuck. Where did we go next? And that's when we would get people like Derek or an expert from the outside. We would go round and round in circles, talking semantics, trying to get the words right, because we understood that those words were so important. Andy's laughing. You've got some similar experience, Andy.
Absolutely, yeah. Finding the words, putting it in accessible speech.
Yeah, and language that both teachers, parents and children could all use and understand. We were really clear that we didn't want our words to be words that teachers and parents would understand and that were inaccessible for our children. We also didn't want to dumb the words down so that they were so simple that they weren't very aspirational. So just, I guess, for us, keeping the momentum going was important, and sometimes we needed to bring in some outside support to help us do that.
One of the things I'll mention there, Susan, that reinforces what Sandy's saying, there's a strong emphasis in a lot of the work that we do and across others do as well on developing that notion of the language of learning. And as Sandy said, that's language that can be used to articulate what learning is and how it's occurring for the students and the teachers and the parents. There's that shared understanding. So that language of learning has become very important. And that's as distinct from simply the language of assessment and test marks and the language of the sorts of things we've been traditionally thinking about schools. This is deeply being able to have conversations with learners about their learning, whether you're a parent, teacher, or a peer. And that's the sort of thing that Sandy's reinforcing here and that we are seeing. And I'm sure, Andy, that's been a key part of your rhetoric to reality journey, yeah?
Yeah, very much so. Culturally accessible, culturally inclusive language.
Yeah.
Concepts often that some of our different cultures that we have understand more so than simply words, or a word that represents a concept is important. So, yeah.
Another thing we often do, so, for example, one of our values is we get there together. What would that look like? What would that feel like? And what would that sound like? And so we use that in the classroom. Well, if we're going to learn together, what might that look like? And the illustration I gave in the maths class, it might look like two children saying, hey, let's try and work this problem out together. I'm finding it really hard. Or it might be real life challenge, a child going, I can't do this, it's too difficult. And the child next to them saying, come on, let's do it together, or we can do this, or let's see if we can find another way. So it's really bringing those values into the way that we talk all the time and giving lots of scaffolds as to how they work.
Susan?
Yes, thank you. I know we're out of time. There was one last question. If you could just stay in a few minutes. I understand if a few people need to drop off right now, but we'll be recording this, which is, can you say a little bit more about mindset versus skill set, or maybe which resources that you use that are most helpful for mindset, because the growth mindset and being open is such a critical part of future-focused schooling and building student agency or learner agency in students and adults as they go through these changes.
Sure. My reference really was around our recruiting of our staff, Susan in particular, and really just referring to the fact that I don't believe there are a lot of teachers across New Zealand who have a depth of skill set in the space that we're hoping to work in. So with the new pedagogies and the new spaces and the new thinking that I guess is required to deliver holistically in that new place, there's not a lot of people that have been trained or have been delivering that. So yeah, the notion of someone who's very skilled in that area is almost, it doesn't exist there in New Zealand, I don't believe at the moment. So it was important for us that if we were to be recruiting the right people who wanted to do the work that we wanted to do, that they needed simply to have some of those growth mindset, sort of open mindset.
Open to learning.
Yeah, that sense where they were prepared to let go of what they've been doing for potentially 15 to 20 years and rethink this for a new future, which I think this is all about now. So it's not in the sense of rocket science idea. It's more, I guess, encouraging people to be open. So when we had our staff we had about probably 60 or 70% of our staff start with us at about 10 weeks early. We spend a lot of time learning and I guess investigating and interrogating why it is that we did what we did and what were the outcomes as a result of those, and were those the outcomes that were still fit for purpose for our kids now, and if they weren't, then we needed to redesign and rethink about how we could do things. So anything from the way that we interact with kids to the way that we construct and design learning with them, not to the way that we engage with our community. Sandy's already talked about it on a global level. How do we do that on a weekly and monthly level to make sure that it's not just token, but that it is actually an integral part of who we are? So on all levels, that sense of being open to doing things differently and in a way that produces the outcomes we want was the basis for that.
Susan.
Any last words before we close from Derek and Sharon? That was a beautiful way to wrap up today, Andy. Thank you. Derek, Sandy?
Look, from me, just really a thank you for the privilege of being able to do this. I've listed our emails on this last slide there, and I'm sure both Sandy and Andy would be quite welcoming of emails at a direct level from any of the participants. And I personally want to just express my thanks to both of these people. It was one of those things, quite spontaneously, call them up because I know the fantastic work that they're doing, and the way that they've conveyed that has been fabulous, I think, and I hope has been of value to those who participated in the conference. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I personally would like to thank all three of you deeply, and also all of the participants that joined us today. Derek, Andy, and Sharon, I know you have been deeply involved in this work over many years. It's complex and really inspiring. Your presentations were fantastic. We're going through a lot of change here, and there are a lot of dedicated educators that really want to help change the future, and we're in the process now of really examining some core principles in our own education system and have an opportunity that's fairly historic to rethink for broader definitions of success and re-engage our communities and families. So I can't tell you how much your presentations mean to us right now in our own journey, and I want to thank you for your time, your insights, and just give you our deepest thanks for all of the work that you've done and the successes that you've had under what are some very significant challenges that you've turned into opportunities for students, for educators, for families and communities. So thank you so much for spending time with us, and please let us know how we may be of service to you in the future and help getting the word out about your great work. We're grateful. Thank you, and thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.